Hello my friends, and welcome to Gamers Tell All, an interview series where I talk to various game critics on the YouTube platform about video games and the effect that it has had on them, and specifically games' ability to create learning in a new and specific way to the medium. Now, I reached out to fellow YouTuber The Game Overanalyser, who wanted to be a part of this series, but for a few reasons he was not able to join us live. Instead, however, he has given me a written out answer to the questions of the interview series, which are, what is the most significant thing you have learned from a game, and how did that game teach you? But he spoke a little bit more generally about the nature of the question itself, as well as went into how Shadow of the Colossus reflectively had an impact on him. And it was a very well thought out piece, so I did want to include it in the series. So without further delay, let's get started. What is the most significant thing you have learned from a video game? This is an interesting question that I'm currently actually wrestling with. Not what I myself have learned, but what signification and learning even means in games. Many developmental psychologists argue that games function as playgrounds for harnessing our skills, whereas others claim what they teach are self-contained and frivolous. But if we accept games as aesthetic objects, what they teach is more comparable to what is learnt in poetry or literature. What we learn in Shadow of the Colossus and Spec Ops: The Line is comparable to Heart of Darkness and Moby Dick, about tragedy, selfishness, human nature, and exploitation. These are the types of games that stick with me, but they only stick with me in retrospect. What do I mean by that? Memory seems to me to be revisionist. We determine significance in retrospect. When I was a kid, what was significant to me was not what I would now deem significant looking back. Answering this question seems more a question of asking what I now value having learnt, reflecting back, and not at the time. This is interesting because part of what I'm thinking about now is how the aesthetic of play seems to exist only by being reflected on, not while play is taking place. There are competing claims by theorists on this front. Frank Lantz argues the aesthetics of play is in metacognitive reflection on thought. Ian Bogost says it comes from the meaning they communicate using the interactive elements. And Miguel Sicart says it is how we, as players, play. We change the aesthetic based on our inputs. I am going back and forth between whether meaning in games exists while a game is being played, or whether it is reflective, and my best answer now is that it is both. How did this game teach this lesson? My answer to this question is a continuation of the first. The question I would pose is, how is it that games communicate their aesthetic properties, given that is what I value, looking at what is significant to me? Again, this is a question game studies is still wrestling with. We have procedural rhetoric, the aesthetics of play, dynamics, etc., all of which make different claims about how games create meaning. Figuring out how games communicate ideas, stories, and meaning, both embodied and reflexive, is the question I am most interested in. And it is a question that is steeped in anthropology, semiotics, philosophy, play theory, cybernetics, and systems analysis. For example, Shadows of the Colossus, one of the games that means a lot to me in retrospect, uses a traditional narrative structure, the hero's journey, a tragic fall, and a monster-slaying motif to invoke an archetypical plot. But it also uses devices exclusive to games. It has meaningful mechanics, dynamic interactions, and uses things like music, camera angles, and its art style to invoke different themes and emotions. How does this game teach this lesson though, and what does that even mean? It uses cognitive dissonance to get you to feel guilty for slaying beasts, using framing and music to communicate tragedy. Its meaning exists in the moment. As we ascend colossi and slay them, we feel both brave and disempowered, simultaneously owing to the control scheme. However, it is the framing of its narrative, causal elements that subsume all of this. The 5 C's of storytelling. A character in conflict makes choices with consequences that lead to change. Wander makes the choice to save his beloved by entering a forbidden land, ignoring all warnings, and his selfish but understandable quest to save her jeopardizes himself and the world at large. I suspect it is also the subtle environmental motifs that pervade the game that I also love, an issue I care about deeply, suggesting there are elements of subjective imposition on a universal understanding of the meaning of play. The best answer I have now for how games communicate meaning involves a synthesis of many ideas. Games are ergodic texts. They require work to uncover, Espen Arseth's cybertext. They are interactive. They respond to a user's inputs and can shift accordingly, Chris Crawford. They are multimedia. They use the tools of other platforms. They are procedural. They communicate using rules and mechanics, Ian Bogost in Persuasive Games. They are dynamic, meaning is collaborative between designer and player, Clint Hawking, Dynamics. They are systemic. There are meanings in systems including the player as a part of the feedback loop, Michael Sellers, Advanced Game Design. They are immersive. They require us to suspend our disbelief and exist in a different sensory and narrative context. They are embodied. It is the hero's journey not vicariously enacted, but done more directly while still being a simulation. They are identity. We, yes us, are actually in the games, and this makes games inherently metatextual and postmodern. User input is unavoidable. They are aesthetic. The determination of value, significance, and meaning is inherently pluralistic and is rife with paradoxes. Meaning shifts based on the context, based on how a game is played, how it is reflected on, and what culture it exists in. Any theory of aesthetics in games needs to accommodate all these, which is why it seems to me to be so difficult. And there we have it. That is the game Overanalyser's contribution to Gamers Tell All. If you liked the video, make sure you also hit the like button so that this video can get shared with other interested people thanks to the marvelous and glorious YouTube algorithm. And also, if you enjoyed the video and would like to see other parts of this series, make sure to hit the subscription bell so that you get a notification whenever a new one goes live. Thank you so much for coming. I will see you next time, and remember, stay true.